Hello and welcome to this video, and today I'm going to be looking at the jazz guitarist and composer Pat Metheny. Now, Pat Metheny was born in 1954. He emerged in the 70s at the sort of height of the jazz fusion boom. He came in with a completely different sound. I think he changed the face of jazz fusion with his approach. He had a completely unique way of approaching fusing jazz and rock music, but also with Latin music and modern classical approaches. And as the 70s went to the 80s, he became one of the most dominant musicians on the 1980s jazz scene, and one of the biggest selling as well. In my recent video on the 80s jazz, I knew that Pat Metheny was this monolith that we would have to deal with separately because he's such a unique voice and such a huge voice in the jazz scene. So what I've done today is I've put together my 10 favourite albums, although I'm going to be looking at more than 10 because that was the only way I could think of doing it. He's made a lot of albums. He's also done a lot of guest appearances on albums. So it's really difficult to really give an overarching view. I'm much more familiar with the albums up until to about 2000, and so I'll be really focusing on those albums. But there's some incredible albums that he's made since, and I'll talk a little bit about that when we get there. So Pat Metheny sort of starts off in the early 70s, almost like a child prodigy. As I said, he's born in 1954. So by 1974, he wasn't even 20 at that point. But by that time, he was a member of the Gary Burton Band. And he was also had a teaching position in one of the big American music colleges, perhaps Berkeley, I'm not too sure. But so this child prodigy's emerged onto the scene. And this is the point where everybody's got their ear to the Mahavishnu Orchestra and John McLaughlin and Larry Coryell. He's the same age as Al Di Meola, so he's emerging at the same time as Al Di Meola, who was another sort of jazz fusion prodigy coming out. But Pat Metheny's influences are completely different to those guitarists. He's grown up listening to people like Wes Montgomery and Jim Hall, so he's playing not with a distorted tone, but with a much more standard jazz clean tone. But still, his tone isn't the same as a Wes Montgomery or a Jim Hall or Kenny Burrell. He's got his own sound going on. His influences musically has really been the Gary Burton Band. Now, I'm going to be doing a video at some point where I'm going to look at the how jazz fusion developed and the importance of Gary Burton's band. Gary Burton had a fusion band in the late 60s, which way before Bitches Brew or the Mahavishnu Orchestra or Tony Williams' lifetime, and it was a pioneering band, but it was a different sound. And I think Pat Metheny really took that sound and he ran with it. So he's really coming out of Gary Burton, and also stylistically he's coming out of players like Ornette Coleman rather than Coltrane. Of course he's influenced by Coltrane, but my point is he's basically emerging with a different sound. He's playing in the Gary Burton Band, that gets him some recognition. Gary Burton is signed to ECM Records, and he signs up to ECM Records and he brings out his first solo album, which is one of the most important jazz albums of the 1970s, which is this one, Bright Size Life. Now this also features Bob Moses on drums and Jaco Pastorius on bass. It's one of the first albums that really launched Jaco Pastorius onto the scene. So he not only emerges as this, incredible voice. What else? This was made when he was 21 years old. It's absolutely incredible. And this trio of Bob Moses and Jaco Pastorius and Pat Metheny is absolutely sublime. This is a sublime album. If he'd have only made this album, he would have gone down in history, because this is one of the great albums. It's a new sound for fusion. And I think part of that is the fact that he'd signed to ECM. When I've read interviews with Pat Metheny, he said the sound of this band was actually a lot heavier, a lot more sort of power trio-y. Power trio-y. Is that a term? But of course, Manfred Eicher, the ECM sound, has this particular sound. Now, what's really interesting in Pat Metheny is he's going to go on to really sell some records. Some of the albums he did with ECM are going to chart in the mainstream charts. So he's going to be one of ECM's biggest sellers. And after this, he brings out there's an album called Watercolors with Eberhard Weber on bass, which is completely different to this album. It's really channeling that ECM sound. And then he comes out with an album called Pat Metheny Group, and he forms the first great Pat Metheny group, with Dan Gottlieb on drums. He then brings out an album called American Garage. So there's a run of these albums with the Pat Metheny group in the late 70s, early 80s, and they're immensely successful. That, like I say, they get in the charts. I think American Garage actually went in the mainstream charts. Rather than pull all those albums out, I've decided, oh my God, and my CDs have all dropped on the floor, so I'm going to be fishing around as this video goes on. But like you see with my videos, they just happen. There's no editing, so we just have to keep going. So the album I'm going to bring up is Pat Metheny Works. And this was brought out in 1984, at the time when he was leaving ECM. And it's a really great album to check out all those other albums on ECM. This is one of the first Pat Metheny albums I ever bought, and I absolutely love this album. I love the programming on it, I think, because there's so much different stuff on here. So let's just look at some of the tracks and the albums that are covered on this. So the first track on here is called Sueno con Mexico, and it's Pat Metheny on guitars and electric bass. It's from a solo acoustic album he made, which on his own, just him, multiple overdubs, but just him on his own. Absolutely fantastic. Really is an essential album if you want to listen to Pat. Then it's got Cross the Heartland from American Garage, or Garage as they say in America. This probably should be American Garage. Pat Metheny on guitar, Lyle Mays on keyboards. Lyle Mays, at this point, he's the keyboardist in the first Pat Metheny group. He goes on to be a very important collaborator with Pat. He died a few years back, but between then, you know, he's so important to the Pat Metheny sound. Lyle Mays was an incredible pianist, incredible composer, and I really feel that his input into what Pat Metheny did cannot be underestimated. Mark Egan on bass, and then Dan Gottlieb on drums. We've also got a track called Travels, which is from the album Travels, which is a live album they brought out. Again, absolutely fantastic album. All these albums are amazing. I didn't know how to bring all those albums in. I could have filled up half my top 10 with the early Pat Metheny group albums, so I thought it was best just to bring this one in. And then we got James Offramp, which I'll be talking about a little bit more. And then on side 2, we got It's For You, which is off the album As Falls Witches Are So Falls Witches Are Falls, which he actually made with Lyle Mays. And again, I think it's just Lyle and Pat. They got Nana Vasconcelos on percussion, and it's an absolutely fantastic album. In fact, It's For You is one of my favourite Pat Metheny tracks ever. And then we got 2 tracks from the album 8081. 8081 is a magnificent album again. Essential Pat Metheny. Look at the lineup: Pat Metheny, Charlie Hayden, Jack DeJohnette, Michael Brecker. And he brought that band together and he composed for it. And the way he uses Michael Brecker, and I think Dewey Redman's also on that album, the way he uses the 2 saxophones is absolutely interesting. And then it closed off with a solo guitar piece called Going Ahead from 8081. So if you want to really just get into the early Pat Metheny group on ECM, check out Works. There's actually another Works that follows on after this that you can check up as well. I'll stick that down there. No, I'll stick that there. Another album from this period that I absolutely love that I didn't put in because I just had to try and cover the whole thing is Rejoicing, which is where he takes on some Ornette Coleman tracks and some other jazz standards, and it's with a jazz trio. Off the top of my head, I think it's Roy Haynes. Who's on bass? I have the feeling it could be Charlie Hayden. You'll have to check this out, Charlie Hayden, or maybe Miroslav Vitor. I think it's Charlie Hayden. But it's an absolutely fantastic album. Again, a completely different thing. So by 1980-81, he's really reshaped jazz, and he's done all these incredible albums. The one for me that I absolutely love that I had to pull out. If I had to pull out one of these albums, I've actually got 2 here, but I'll explain why. Would be this one, Offramp. This is the one where he brings in the guitar synth. Pat Metheny plays jazz guitar, acoustic guitar, sometimes 12-string, and he also plays guitar synth, and he has this signature sound on guitar synth, and he really, brings it in here. And there's a track on here called Are You Going With Me, which is one of his signature tracks, and it's absolutely incredible. His solo is just so otherworldly, and it just builds up and takes you to a level. Pat's sound can be very soft. I've talked on this channel about Fusac, that sort of middle of the road jazz, the sort of Yellow Jackets type of thing that often happens in jazz, you know, the spyrogyras of those. And I don't dislike that jazz. I can listen to those albums, and I like some of them. I really love, like David Sanborn. I really love. Pat Metheny isn't making jazz like the Mahavishnu Orchestra. He's making quite easy listening jazz. That's why it's sold so much. But I would hate to describe him as easy listening. I think he's just created a style which is so amazing that it just crosses over people. It's very melodic. But all the way through with Pat, you have the feeling that there's an avant-garde musician in there as well. And often on his albums, even the most sort of, I don't want to use easy listening or middle of the road, because they're not. But even the albums that are easier on the ear, let's describe like that, often have things on there that aren't like that. And this one is one of those albums for me, because it opens up with a track called Baccarel. And Baccarel's strange, right? There's also a track called The Bat, and The Bat's strange. Offramp is strange. So half of this album is almost like Ornette Coleman primetime weird and all ambient strange stuff, and some of it is very easy on the ears. I'm going to use the term easy on the ears. But even when Pat's easy on the ears, it's still monumental music. He's really created his own sound, and I think that's what's going to come across in this video. In 1984, he brings out this album, which is the last one on ECM Records. I put this one as well because this is one of my very favourite Pat Metheny albums, called First Circle. Again, it really shows him now starting to move towards Latin jazz. He's starting to expand out his sound to contain like wordless vocals, a lot more percussion. This is an absolutely wonderful album. We've got some great playing on here. But it's the last album on ECM. ECM have a very signature sound. And even though he's such a big seller, I think Manfred Eicher, who ran ECM Records, you know, Pat was having differences with him in what he wanted to do musically. I think he wanted to expand his sound past that sort of very almost like a classical music approach to recording jazz sound that ECM had. I've made a video on ECM Records if you want to check out and find out more about ECM Records. I think at this time, 1984, he wanted to do different things. So he had to part company with ECM, and he signs up with Geffen Records, which was like a big pop label at the time. Okay, and so he's moved to this big pop label. He's now able to, what's he going to do? Make his sound more commercial? You know, bring in vocals. Well, he does both. He actually makes a record with David Bowie for the film The Falcon and the Snowman. Called This Is America, and he gets a top 40 chart hit. So he does that. This is the breadth of the guy, but he also brings out this beast, Song X, which is a duet album with Ornette Coleman. This is a heavy album. So by this time, I was a big Pat Metheny fan. I'd got Offramp, I'd got 8081, I'd got Rejoicing, I'd got First Circle. I really thought I knew his sound, and then I bought this. And I've got to be honest, this was also my introduction to Ornette Coleman. So what we have here is Ornette Coleman-esque free jazz, harmonic jazz, right? He's got two drummers on here, the great Jack DeJohnette and also Donaldo Coleman, Charlie Hayden on bass, and then Pat Metheny and Ornette are playing together a lot of the time, with his insanely intense free jazz approach. His guitar sound is otherworldly. It sounds like a sort of clean jazz guitar but mixed with synth sounds. And sometimes it sounds like he's playing more than one line at the same time. It's absolutely incredible album. A difficult album for me. I really had to work at this. So this is where I got my head around Ornette Coleman, because I was such a big Pat Metheny fan. And this is the interesting thing with jazz, and I may talk about this at some point, is sometimes you have to put the work in. You don't get it and you have to put the work in. And there's only one way to put the work in, and that's to stick the headphones on and listen. And you have to listen, and you have to start thinking, I'm listening to the wrong things. I'm trying to look for something that's not there, rather than listening to what is there. And that is always the key. You got to work out what you're listening to. They're not doing what you want them to do. They're doing something else. It's beyond what your expectations are. And that was one of those albums for me. And by really starting to understand it, I got my head around Ornette Coleman's way of improvising, which actually became a huge influence on me. I'd sort of grown up with a real scalar in terms of my guitar playing. It was a real scalar approach. You know, you have a chord and there's a scale, and if you want to play outside, you're going to bring in a sort of substitute scale which covers that chords. With Ornette Coleman, I felt that he was thinking much more in terms of phrasing, rhythm, sound, and the direction and motion of the solo. So he would take his solo in the way he wanted to go. You know, he's not playing with the tune, but he may be playing on the rhythm of the tune more than just focusing all the time on the harmonic structure. So this is a very important album to me. I put it in there. Those of you who want to know about Pat Metheny, may not be a first album to look at. This is why you're going to find out there's more than 10 albums in here, because some of these are anomalies, and this is one of the anomaly ones. And as we get on, there's going to be some even more extreme anomalies coming up. Right, so on the floor here, we have a ton of CDs that dropped that I had in some sort of order. So I might go a little bit out of order, but I will try and bust my way through in true jazz style. So they're going to come at me as they come. So I think that's the only way to do it. Yeah, right. So he then brings out a series of albums in the late 80s and it's like the second Pat Metheny group. He's now got Paul Wurtigo on drums. This is immensely successful. He makes a lot of records that get on Jazz FM radio in America. You know, very, very popular, and it's a very appealing sound. It can be a very heavy sound. Some of it is incredible. I felt I just wanted to pull one album out from that period to show you, which is my favourite one, which is this, Still Live Talking. And on there's a track called The Third Wind. It contains two incredible Pat Metheny guitar solos. It's worth buying just for that track. That is the composition and epicness of that track. And Pat Metheny, he's almost like a progressive rock musician, but his compositional skills are so way beyond most prog musicians that the compositions are utterly breathtaking. This is a fantastic album. All the albums, like Secret Story, all those albums from that period are absolutely fantastic albums, you know. So we've now got Pat here in the late 80s with this sort of very, you know, commercial jazz sound that he's pioneered. It doesn't sound like anybody else. It's not like Fusac or middle of the road jazz. It's not funky, it's not disco-y, it's not relying on vocals, and yet people love it. And you know, I saw Pat Metheny 2 or 3 times at this period, and it was in huge, it's almost like arena size. You know, he's playing to thousands all over the world. And at this point, he almost starts to have, for me, 2 areas of interest. There's that song interesting bit which is real avant-garde, extreme jazz. He's really pushing at the boundaries, and he's also in the very commercial realm at the same time. I've always found him very interesting for that. Right. And I might be a little bit out of order now because my CD's dropped all on the floor. But another album I wanted to bring up, which is another anomaly really, is this one. I absolutely love this. John Scofield and Pat Metheny. I love John Scofield. He's the other great guitarist from the 1980s, along with Pat. They finally get together on this album. They did not let down. It's an amazing album. They share compositions on here, and they share soloing, and it's really interesting because Pat alters his tone. Up until then, Pat had sort of the acoustic guitar sound, but the 2 famous sounds was his sort of iconic jazz guitar sound, the Gibson 335 sound, and then the guitar synth sound. Here he starts using little bits of overdriving and more blues bends and stuff like that. And his guitar playing on it is absolutely fantastic. I thought he was going to really... that there was going to be a big difference between Pat and Scofield, such different approaches. But when you hear them together, at certain points, it's actually quite hard to tell them apart. This is a fantastic album if you want to listen to Pat's guitar playing. The lineup's amazing. Scofield, Pat Metheny on guitar, 2 guitars up front, and then Steve Swallow on electric bass, which Pat had played for in the Gary Burton Band, and then Bill Stewart on drums. The great Bill Stewart, one of the great jazz drummers of our era. Right, so here is an album from 1994, same year. Zero Tolerance for Silence. This is one of the most avant-garde extreme albums in my collection. At some point I'm going to do like, I don't know whether to call it like unlistenable albums, you know. But if I do, this will be in there. So here's lovely Pat with his lovely, easy on the ears, you know, Latin jazz fusion going on, and he's getting on the radio. At the same time, the guy can make this. And the first track, which is called Part 1, is nearly 20 minutes long, and it's just sheer distorted feedback noise. Is this one of his great albums or one of his worst albums? I love it because you can't tell, you know. Actually, the other Part 2, Part 3, Part 4, Part 5, there's some really interesting compositional ideas, but what really sets the tone for this is that first 20-minute track, which is just one great long power chord of noise. I think Pat is interesting of pushing the envelope, and he's interesting of trying new things, and they inform his playing. So just out of curiosity, it's well worth going and checking that album out. Another album that's not as far out, if you really want to just dip your toe into the more avant-garde side, the more improvisational side, this is a fantastic album. This is made with the sort of second Pat Metheny group, the one Paul were to go on drums, got Steve Robdy on bass, Lyle Mays on piano, and it's an improvised sort of quartet album. This one isn't as extreme as Song X or Zero Tolerance, but it's still got some quite avant-garde ideas. That's a good place if you just want to see him stretching out. It's a wonderful album. There's some incredible playing on there. Around the same time of this, he releases another one of my favourite albums ever that he did. You know, so I think my three favourites would be Offramp, First Circle, and this one, which is called Imaginary Day. Everything's in code on there, and the way that you work out the code is it's got this sort of, the CD sort of spins, you know, and you can sort of work out the code, and you can get into I think there's like a story. It's called Imaginary Day, and it's like this day storyline is very, very. But this is the Pat Metheny group sound that we know from the 80s, but hardened up and toughened up. This is a fantastic album. The compositions are incredible. He does everything that Pat Metheny can do. This is a great starting point for Pat Metheny. You know, if you want to just go and buy an album straight off, try Imaginary Day. It's a wonderful album. Right. Okay, just 3 more albums to go through. I'm going to bring up another one here. Look at this one. This is called Sign of 4. Right, that's what the cover looks like, Sign of 4. It's actually a 3 CD package. It features, on here is, let's get the line up because I'm not 100% sure. I'd have to find it. I'm pretty sure it's Paul Wertico on drums, Greg Bendian on percussion, and then it's Pat Metheny and the great improvising guitarist Derek Bailey. This is another far out album, 3 discs of full on free improvisation with one of the greatest free improvisations that ever lived on guitar, Derek Bailey. That's a far out album. Another anomaly in there. So I think I brought 3 anomalies in. So you've got my top 10 and then you've got these anomalies going on. Right, so like I said, after this point, I have not listened to all the albums he's made. There's a lot of albums he's made since 2000. One I would like to bring in is Pat Metheny Trio, which he made in 2000 with Bill Stewart and Larry Grenadier on bass. Album jazz standards, jazz trio, straight down the line. You wanted him playing jazz, listen to this. It's a fantastic album. They brought a live album out as well. That's fantastic as well. And the last one on my list is another utter masterpiece. Right, I think I would have to have this in my top 4 without a doubt, and it's called The Way Up. Now this is one track called The Way Up. One track which is 68 minutes long. It's through composed. Right, you can't dip into it. You have to put your head in there, you know, and listen to the whole thing, or you don't understand it. It's composition. It works all the way through. It's not filled out with loads of soloing or long ambient sections. It's properly composed. They went out and played this live. God knows how they memorised this, but it's absolutely incredible. So The Way Up, an album. He's done a lot of different projects since then. You know, he's made solo acoustic guitar albums, jazz trio albums, or the compositional albums. The one album that stands out for me in recent times, which I just thought was absolutely incredible, was called Orchestrion. And it really showed how mad Pat Metheny is, you know, where he basically created this huge room of sort of robot instruments. You know, these little robots that could play drums or play piano or play the bass or play weird bottles. And he could control them all from his guitar and loop them up, and he could create these compositions all from his guitar. It's an utter incredible achievement, and he went out and toured that. So that's my take on Pat Metheny. So how does he rate in terms of importance in jazz? He's one of the greats. In the 70s, when jazz fusion emerges, jazz fusion isn't just about the fusion between jazz and rock music. It's fusing it in certain types of ways, and we see basically, I can see sort of three basic types of fusion that emerge in the 70s. There's the Mavic Orchestra, very intense, sort of launching yourself at the horizon approach. There's the very spacey, ethereal weather report approach with the group improvisation, and then there's the Headhunters funky, you know, crossover disco sound that ends up with Fusak in the 70s. And they're the three approaches. They're all linked in, and they all sort of cross over a bit. Pat Metheny then comes out with another way of playing jazz fusion, and it completely dominates the 80s. And I think that's his importance. He changes the sound of the guitar. He changes the way you play guitar. He changes the way you compose, you know, for jazz fusion music. He changes the rules commercially. He shows how successful jazz can be. He's got a signature sound and signature style. He's really one of the great jazz composers, you know, of the last 50 years. I can't rate him high enough. But anyway, that's been my video on Pat Metheny. If you liked it, please like the video, subscribe, put your comments in, and I'm sure there's a whole ton of albums I've missed out, so put those in the comments as well. Again, thank you for listening, and I'll see you soon. Bye.